So it never ceases to amaze me how the atheists on YouTube think that they're so clever, just by virtue of being non-believers, that they can outwit a man, namely Dr. Craig, who has devoted his life to studying and developing arguments like the Kalam Cosmological argument. It really takes a special kind of arrogance, I think, to do something like this, but that's just me, I don't know. It'd be one thing if the arguments were well-researched and there was some effort put into them, but usually the arguments are just recycled and outdated or based on ignorance, and despite all of this, they're arrogant and condescending, which just makes it all the more ridiculous. I mean, I could actually understand a poor argument, but to have a poor argument and then also to be arrogant and condescending is another thing altogether. There's a reason for this, though. Atheism is just an irrelevant philosophy. Atheists have nothing new to contribute, and they haven't for decades. Ever since positivism was refuted back in the early 1900s, atheists have been forced to desperately fight a losing battle by trying anything they can to deny the facts. But I digress. Your video falls into the category of outdated and recycled. I could go on setting up this video for a while, but who cares? Let's get to the point. You spend several minutes talking about how this leaf falling in the woods in a particular spot at a particular time was incredibly unlikely. To add to the effect, you make your voice echo. Not really sure why, but anyway, you then say that this leaf falling in this particular spot at a particular time isn't impressive. It's not. And you say it's not impressive, just like Craig's argument about the improbability of fine-tuning is not impressive. Well, no, not quite. But first, Craig says, we know that life-permitting universes are vastly more probable than any life-permitting universe. So in your video you ask, we who? Well, scientists, for instance. The only folks denying this are atheist proselytizers who are desperate to make reality jive with their philosophy. Desperate, yes, I said desperate. Pretty straightforward. Any tweaking of the physical constants of the universe have such profound effects on the actual physical structure of the universe that life of any kind would not exist. Don't bother appealing to silicon life forms and so on, because they won't exist either. Simple as that. There are far more combinations of constants that would lead to a universe expanding too fast for cosmic structures like solar systems and planets and so on to form, than there are values that would allow these structures to form, or that would allow the universe to be relatively flat enough, for instance, for the structures to form. So there are far more values that would give us a universe with only a few basic elements than there are universes which would give us the range we have in ours. In other words, the amount of elements necessary for life. Therefore, given a randomly assigned combination of physical constants, it is much more likely that the universe would not be able to sustain life of any kind. So you can feel free to deny this, but if you can't even agree on the basics of the argument, then I don't have time to correct your misconceptions. There's other videos on YouTube that can set you straight. You say, our first clue that Craig is misusing probability is that he's deriving his figures from a sample set of 1, as we've never observed another universe to compare ours to, ... When you use a sample set of 1, then the probability can only be 1 to 1. No. What? What does this even mean? So if there were 2 universes to compare ours to, then the chances of ours being one that exists would be 1 of 2? That's 50%, which means that it becomes increasingly unlikely the more universes there are that our universe would exist. Which is absurd, because obviously the opposite is true, which leads people to the argument of the multiverse. So I'm not sure where we're getting that logic from. Craig is not deriving his probability from our universe alone, but rather from the set of all possible values of the physical constants. I'll elaborate on this in a second, but first, you say Craig is operating under the assumption that the constants can be altered. Who said anything about altering the values? The values are, in a sense, assigned upon the creation of the universe. Why would they be assigned this way de facto? You have the burden of proof to demonstrate that the values must be this way rather than any other. Yes, you have the burden of proof. You have no reason to think they should be the way they are. Because otherwise, you're the one operating under an unproven assumption that the values must be the way they are when the universe is created. This is an unnecessary and unproven assumption. You also say Craig is only assuming only a certain kind of life is possible. No, Craig is not, and he stated this numerous times. The fact is, it's much more likely that the universe should have values that cause it to collapse in on itself or expand so fast that solar systems never form, and so on. What kind of life would exist in a universe without solar systems? What kind of life would exist in a singularity? None, obviously. And that's just one example of many. But I want to get back to that statement you made earlier about the universe being the only sample we have, and therefore the probability that this specific universe would exist is 1. No. What you mean to say is that the probability that this universe does exist is 1. That's logically equivalent to saying that the universe exists. Well, no duh. There is a 100% chance, given that the universe exists, that the universe exists. That tells us precisely nothing. So where do you really go wrong? Well, you're conflating the improbability of all events as being equally insignificant. The problem is, as Craig points out elsewhere, it's not just that any universe's existence is equally unlikely, but rather that it then is much more unlikely that the universe that does exist would conform to a pattern. Let's use your leaf example. What would be much more significant is if leaves randomly falling in the woods spelled out, "Hey, Dark Antics, how are you doing today?" on the forest floor. You see, what makes the probability of that so unbelievable is that the falling leaves conform to a pattern. Let's use another example that I used recently elsewhere. Let's say license plates are generated randomly in some city. As you're driving in that city, you see a license plate that says 14XLI9. You probably wouldn't think anything of it. It's improbable that that plate would exist, but only as improbable as any other plate is. But what if you saw a license plate that said Hot Rod? Would you assume that this was random chance? Obviously not. You would assume that it was created that way, custom designed. Why? Because it's a pattern. Just as the physical constants of the universe conform to a pattern that allows the universe to evolve life. I used examples of language, but that's just for simplicity. It doesn't have to involve language, just a pattern. And yet the license plate example is much more probable than fine-tuning. So it seems to me you have one of three options. One, you can claim that it's more likely that this license plate was created by chance and that you saw it by chance, which would be stupid. Two, you can contradict yourself and admit that while the license plate was probably custom-made, the universe itself clearly isn't, because otherwise atheism would be more unlikely than theism, and that's not cool. Or three, appeal to a bunch of metaphysical ideas, like the multiverse, not because you're a free thinker, but because you have a prior obligation to atheism that overrides your ability to follow the evidence wherever it leads. I think the only thing worse than your argument, to be honest, is the head-nodding atheist in the comments section who think it's actually a good argument. But that's just me.